All right, well, 6:01. It's a beautiful cold afternoon, so let's get going here. My name is Jonathan Weber. I direct the Complete Streets program at Local Motion. I'm joined tonight by my colleague Susan Grasso, and we'll be your hosts and speakers for tonight's presentation. So first of all, thanks for being here. We've spent a good amount of time pulling together this learning network event, and we really hope you're going to find it useful. So just before we get started, our presentation takes about 30 minutes, so it's a little bit of a shorter one tonight. We'll have time for questions throughout and then at the end. And you can feel free to put questions and comments in the chat box at any time. And if you are coming into the webinar with any questions or comments about bike parking, feel free to post them in there as well. If you have any technical issues, you can also post those in the chat box, or you can contact us at susan@localmotion.org or Jonathan. Well, actually, contact susan@localmotion.org, not me, because I'm going to be running the webinar. And we are recording tonight. We'll share the recording with you in the next few days, along with some resources related to tonight's presentation. So tonight, we're talking about bike parking, one of my favorite subjects. And we have a lot of material to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. So Local Motion is Vermont's only statewide walking, biking, and rolling advocacy organization. Our mission is to make it safe, accessible, and fun for everyone to walk, bike, and roll in Vermont. And this is a big goal, and our success really depends on Vermonters like you who are working to make change in your community. One of the ways we support you in making that change in your community is through educational resources like this webinar tonight. This is the fourth in a 5-part series we've been hosting this winter and spring. And this series has really taken the knowledge that Susan and I have sort of built over the years, and it distills it down to the most essential things for you to know and be successful. We're, of course, always still around for you as a resource, but the hope here is to arm you with some knowledge so you can be more effective. Our first webinar of the series really considered the walk bike movement retrospectively and into the future. We talked a little bit about land use. We talked about what it takes to get more people walking and biking. The webinar after that looked at why communities should create a plan for investing in their active transportation infrastructure, as well as what policies and programs can support that. Our third webinar, we looked at funding opportunities for active transportation infrastructure in Vermont. Tonight, we're of course talking about bike parking, and then our final webinar after this is going to look at traffic calming and low-cost solutions with a focus on more rural areas. We'll put a link in the chat to that registration, and it'll also be in the resources document that we'll follow up with. So tonight's webinar is all about bike parking, why it matters, how to do it well, how to improve it in your town, and what resources are available to help you get it done. Before we go any further, I do want to just mention, as a local advocate, bike parking is a great thing for you to work on. Bike parking improvements usually don't require a ton of planning, so you're not getting involved in a long planning study that's going to take years. It's often fairly affordable, so you might be able to help your community actually apply for grants to improve bike parking, or maybe you can work directly with property owners to get that done. The design requirements for bike parking are pretty straightforward. You don't need an engineering degree to get this stuff done. So this is a great subject for local advocates to really provide some meaningful help with. We're going to start off with a poll. If I can get it figured out. Yeah, here we go. All right, so I've launched a poll, and the poll here is, which of these bike parking examples is the worst? And you can choose A, B, C, D, or E. So vote for the one that you would least like to park your bike at. And we'll give it a minute while the results come in here. And these, at least some of these are places where I sometimes have to park my bike. So we've all dealt with bad bike parking. All right, we've got, just give it another couple seconds here. Almost everybody has replied. All right, we'll go ahead and end the poll. So we wound up, I'm not sure if people are seeing the results. Yeah, I'll show the results here. So A, far and away, took the win for the worst bike parking, followed closely by C, and then E, and then B and D were tied. So yeah, A is really pretty bad. It's a nice sunny spot, but there's really like nowhere to put a bike. I mean, you can't even really attach your bike to that rack in a meaningful way. You could maybe put a tire in it, but locking up is going to be a real challenge. So people have, I think, a pretty good intuition clearly for bad bike parking. These are all pretty bad, whether, mostly because the design of the racks is really bad, but also some of these examples, there just isn't enough bike parking. But people kind of know bad bike parking when they see it. And we're going to get into the problems with bad bike parking, what causes bad bike parking, and also what good bike parking looks like. So a bike infrastructure network is made up of those safe and connected routes to get people where they're going. And once people are at their destination, they need bike parking, right? If it isn't there, people might not bike, their bikes might get stolen, et cetera. So bike parking alone is not going to make your bike network. You need all that connecting infrastructure on the street between the bike parking. But if you don't have the bike parking in place, all that infrastructure isn't very useful. A lack of good bike parking, it can leave bikes susceptible to theft because it's hard to lock securely without a good rack to lock to. It can discourage people from riding either because they don't know if there's adequate bike parking at destinations, or maybe they know that there isn't. It can result in damage to bikes when bikes wind up jammed into inadequate racks or parked to objects that don't allow for the bike to be kept stable. When bikes are locked to trees, that can actually cause damage to the trees. And when there isn't good bike parking, sometimes people wind up, parking their bike in a way that blocks a sidewalk or blocks an entrance. Think about people like locking to a parking meter where there isn't really room to do that. That can cause for the sort of interface between the street and the sidewalk to be blocked, or for the sidewalk itself to be blocked. So it's not good. It causes problems. Good bike parking, meanwhile, it makes it easy and intuitive to securely park a bike, and that reduces the likelihood of theft and damage. It encourages people to bike by giving them confidence that there is somewhere for them to store their bike, whether that's for a long-term stop or a short-term stop. And we'll get into the discrepancy between those two in a moment. And good bike parking also really enhances the public realm because it ensures that bikes are parked in an organized way, trees aren't damaged, sidewalks aren't blocked, all that good stuff. This is an important slide because it's really key to understand the distinction between short-term and long-term bike parking. So short-term bike parking is generally for stops under 2 hours. It's usually located outside and it's usually not enclosed. Short-term bike parking being outside and unenclosed is part of what makes it more convenient, right? Because if it's outside, you don't have to open a door or walk your bike around inside a building. So if you're just trying to get a coffee or stop at the hardware store, you want the rack to be typically outside on the street because that's really easy. Long-term bike parking is generally for stops longer than 2 hours. It's often indoors, but it's always at least enclosed, so that gives it more security. That enclosure also makes it less convenient to use since you've got to navigate a door or an indoor area, but you're sort of you're willing to endure that inconvenience because it's much more secure than just an outdoor rack. And if you're stopping for a long time, maybe because you're storing your bike at work, that extra security is worth the little bit of hassle to get your bike in there. So just to give you a sense of what they look like, this is short-term bike parking. This is in front of the YMCA in Burlington. This is probably what a lot of people think of just as bike parking. It's the racks that we see out on the street. Those are short-term bike parking. And good short-term bike parking is located usually right at the front door, exactly where people intuitively want to make that transition from being on their bike to walking or rolling. And these racks in this photo are well designed, they're well located, and they're also very well used. Long-term bike parking looks more like this. So it's a fully enclosed structure. It's security controlled by some means, whether that's a physical key or a key fob or some other way of controlling access. And that ensures that only people who should have access to the long-term bike parking do. And since these bikes are being stored for longer periods of time, the users are okay with that inconvenience of having to unlock the door and maybe even lift their bike onto a second tier rack. So first up, we're going to talk about the fundamentals of what makes short-term bike parking, and a lot of this also applies to long-term bike parking. So again, we're talking about bike parking that is for stops 2 hours or shorter. It's usually outdoor. It's typically not enclosed, but it can be covered. And it is convenient, but less secure. As I said in that slide about the YMCA, the best place for short-term bike parking is as close as possible to that intuitive transition point from when you want to go from being on your bike to walking or rolling and sort of moving to the interior or moving into your destination. So good location usually means being as close as possible to and visible from the front door of the destination. That's that transition point. And it's also generally better to locate bike parking in high traffic areas because that sort of sense of eyes on the street, people being around, can help to deter theft. In terms of the design of racks, a lot of racks get this wrong, as we saw in our poll. The key feature is that the design allows for users to park in such a way that the bicycle rests against the rack with 2 points of contact. You can see that in this graphic. This helps to keep the bike stable so it's not rolling around back and forth while you're trying to park. And it also makes it easier to lock securely with a U-lock or a chain, as shown in this graphic. So there are essentially two types of racks that fulfill this criteria of 2 points of contact that they don't have other issues. So these are the two types of rack that really work. They are the inverted U rack, shown on the left, which is also called a hoop rack, and the post and ring rack, which is shown on the right. The hoop rack on the left is really the gold standard for bike parking. It's intuitive, it works well, and it's really popular. So when people see it, they know that that's a bike rack. The post and ring racks work, but they don't usually provide as much stability since the contact points are usually closer together. But we consider these as usable bike racks because they're helpful for tight spaces, and they can also be really useful in some cases. A post, whether that's from a parking meter or a sign, can actually be converted into a post and ring rack. A bunch of companies make little attachments that actually hook onto the post to turn it into a bike rack. So these can be useful when necessary, but the U rack or the hoop rack is really the gold standard. There are many, many more types of racks that do not work, and some of them are shown here. These are all types of racks that are basically junk, and you should avoid them. These generally do not provide those 2 points of contact, and the ones that do are typically not intuitive to lock too securely, or they just make that a little bit difficult in various ways. So, the schoolyard rack that you see here, also called a wheel bender, that's a very common type of bike rack. The problem with these is that typically you can only get your wheel to contact the rack, and this makes it very hard to lock the frame of the bicycle. And also people tend to jam too many bikes into these, and that can cause damage. The wave rack shown in the bottom right is also very popular. The problem with this is that it doesn't provide those 2 points of contact. Again, you typically only get 1 point of contact, so the bike is usually not stable. And then some people, in order to get those 2 points of contact, will park like parallel to the length of the rack, and that takes up a lot of space. So these are all types of racks that you shouldn't bother using. Layout of the racks that make up your bike parking is also really important. This ensures that there's appropriate spacing between the racks so that they're all usable, and that they don't wind up blocking walkways or curb ramps. So there's a lot of great guidance out there for these specifications, and we'll provide information on that in our resource document. There are several different ways that racks can be installed. So in-ground mounting on the left is the most secure. So with this method, the rack is placed into concrete as it's curing. or the concrete can finish curing and then holes can be drilled for the rack. The rack is placed in the holes and then they're backfilled with epoxy. And this method is obviously more labor intensive. It doesn't allow for the rack to be easily moved later on. So this makes it more secure because there's no way to just like detach the rack from the ground very easily, but it also can be less convenient for property owners. So surface mounting in the middle is probably the most popular. With this method, you've got small holes that are drilled in concrete. It can be fully cured, old concrete, doesn't matter. So you drill small holes in the concrete and then expanding anchors are hammered into those holes and the rack then mounts to those anchors. So that's a really popular method. Rail mounting shown on the right is also really popular. So with this option, 3 or more hoops can be attached to a set of steel rails, and this forms sort of a freestanding unit, and that can be either anchored to the surface or it can just be placed on it. Rail mounting is a bit less secure because the rack is movable, and the hoops can technically be detached from the rails. But as the number of hoops increases on the rails, and typically you can go up to 6, it makes the rack heavier and less movable. So this is a great option for scenarios where there's no available concrete to mount racks to. Maybe you're in a park and you just need to put the rack on the grass or on mulch. Also, if you're working on asphalt, you actually can't really surface mount the asphalt because it just doesn't have enough structural rigidity. So a rack on rails can be a great option for asphalt. I'll note that I mentioned rack theft a minute ago. This is not really something that we hear about in Vermont, but it's a possibility. And it actually became an issue in some places outside of the state when steel prices spiked several years ago. So not too much of a concern right now in terms of people stealing bike racks, but there is potential for that. Rail-mounted racks can be really useful for a variety of situations. The one shown here, a rack is placed on pavers. That really wouldn't work well for in-ground or surface mounting. And as I mentioned on that last slide, grass, mulch, asphalt, those are all great options to use a rail-mounted rack. The disadvantage of these is that they are a bit more expensive, especially in the shipping, because you have to get those rails. But there are examples of people using like 2x8 lumber to mount racks to, and that can work, especially as a temporary option. And the other great use for rail mounting is when you have a property owner who often for winter maintenance, they want to be able to move the rack. So this is a great option. They can have a couple of people pick it up, move it out of the way, and then plow or shovel. Signage is also really important, especially if it's not feasible to locate bike parking right at the front entrance. So this slide shows a rack that's intentionally signed for cargo bike use. But just generally, signing bike parking is a great idea if it's not obvious where it is. And we will get into cargo bike specific racks a little later on. Bike corrals are a great option to keep in mind. Sometimes if you're working in a downtown or a village center, it can be really hard to find space for bike parking if you're only looking sort of on the sidewalk, right? Oftentimes we just don't have that much room. Bikes do take up, a significant amount of space when you're talking about, a 5 or 6 foot sidewalk. So oftentimes there just isn't room. A bike corral basically allows you to repurpose some car parking as bike parking. So they're set up in a car parking space or in the street. And it's usually possible to park 6 or more bikes in one car parking space. And this corral actually shown here is in downtown Brattleboro. So we're going to briefly touch on art racks here. When communities look at improving their bike parking, they often get the idea to make it artistic and fun. And this is not necessarily a problem, but we need to make sure that the rack functions as a bike rack first and as art second. So these are both examples of bike racks that are really doing the opposite. They're functioning as art first and bike racks second, and the result is usually wasted space. So the rack on the left is in Montpelier. As you can tell, it can really only park one bike, and it doesn't even park that one bike very well. If they had installed just hoop racks, that space could probably have fit 2 hoop racks, which would park 4 bikes really efficiently and securely. The rack on the right is in Brattleboro, and while I love the bike-shaped rack idea, there's a similar issue here. That rack is really long. It's probably only going to park 2 bikes, whereas 2 or 3 hoop racks in the same space could probably park 4 or 6 bikes much more securely and intuitively. And you can see in the photo here, the cargo bike that's parked there is not using the rack, unfortunately. Here's another example. This is from Burlington. This one's a little better, but you can see how the design still results in unusable spaces. The tilt of the portion of the rack that the bikes lock to also results in a lot of the bikes sort of toppling over. So while the idea here was to enhance the public realm with an artistic rack, it winds up that people can't really park to the rack in a way that really looks well organized and enhances the public realm in its use. So I think probably just traditional hoop racks here would look a lot better. Here's an example of some art racks that actually work pretty well. The French presses shown here are basically just hoop racks with some additional pieces, so they can be locked to pretty easily. And even the bike-shaped rack in this photo it's a more reasonable size, and it'll mostly function just like another hoop rack. So just generally speaking, make sure that your bike rack functions as a bike rack first, and if you want to make it artistic, just be very intentional about how it's designed. E-bike charging is something we occasionally get questions about. Racks that provide charging are still fairly uncommon, and they're somewhat expensive, but this is a growing category and something that can become more popular in coming years. Charging functionality can really greatly increase the cost of the rack. So both of these options shown here sort of store the charger for the bike in an enclosed panel. And I think both of these also have like a user interface that allows the property owner to price for the charging. There are simpler versions of e-bike racks that just have an outlet sort of built into them, so it still needs to be wired for the electricity. But it's just a simple sort of plug-in, and those are a bit more affordable, but they don't provide the option for the property owner to charge for the power. So providing public e-bike charging, it's a little unclear sort of what the need is here that we're addressing. So just be really intentional to make sure that there's a clear need. Maybe you're located on a long distance bike route and there are people touring on their e-bikes. That seems to make sense. But in my mind, most people who are biking into work for the day are likely going to charge at home. And so it may really not be necessary to provide like public, especially short-term e-bike charging. It might make a little more sense for long-term parking. So with cargo bikes, most use a kickstand that sort of keeps the bike upright rather than it being leaned on the rack the way that a traditional bike would. They also usually have a big box on the front, and both of these features can make it tricky to park a cargo bike to a traditional hoop rack. So we're starting to see some racks aimed at addressing this, including the option shown here, which is from Ceres. This has sort of this hinged arm, which swings toward the bike and allows for locking. So cool design, and I'm sure we're going to see more options like this. And besides racks specifically designed for cargo bikes, you got to keep in mind that cargo bikes are much bigger than traditional bikes. So they do need more space between and around racks. So if you're designing your bike parking with cargo bikes in mind, just consider giving some more space. You could also designate the racks on the ends of your row as racks for cargo bikes, and think about increasing the spacing between walls and other objects. So this is kind of a crazy picture. It's so many bikes, and sometimes it's just not realistic to build enough permanent bike parking for seasonal events like farmers markets, outdoor concerts, that kind of thing. So this is where valet bike parking comes in. So with valet bike parking, people drop bikes off with staff who are monitoring sort of that large area where bikes are being stored temporarily. There are lots of valet bike parking programs around the world. Local Motion has run a valet bike parking program for several years now. It mostly operates just in Chittenden County. We haven't really scaled it to other communities because it's pretty staff intensive. But feel free to reach out if this is something you'd like to explore for an upcoming event in your town. And we are hoping to offer a DIY guide for setting up valet bike parking in your community sometime in the future. So keep an eye out for that. Repair stations and tire pumps are great amenities to incorporate into your short-term bike parking. These allow, someone to fix a flat tire or make a quick adjustment. It is worth knowing that these stations require some maintenance and monitoring, so the tools can tend to disappear over time. And the pumps are pretty robust. They're made for outdoor use, but they do still require rubber gaskets and seals, and those are going to need to be replaced eventually. So repair stations are great amenities to provide, but make sure you think about how maintenance is going to be handled before you install one of these. So that's our section on short-term bike parking. I think we've got maybe a couple questions.
Yeah, we do have a couple of great questions here. We've got one question. Any good short-term parking solutions to support our e-bike riders? Due to the high value of these e-bikes, short-term bike parking often doesn't feel secure enough, especially in urban centers.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing is to just the basics. Make sure it's a good hoop rack. Make sure you have good hoop racks around. I think that parking e-bikes in visible locations where there are lots of eyes on the street is a good idea. I do think there's probably going to be a need for more sort of publicly accessible long-term bike parking. We don't really have any of that in the state right now. That is something you see in some bigger cities, especially overseas. There are just large bike parking garages, especially close to transit stations. So yeah, I think that's a good point and probably something that we're going to see as an emerging need.
And if I could just add to that and say, I think here's where trying to place your bike parking as near to the entrances of buildings as possible can also help to make e-bike riders feel more secure in parking their bikes.
Yeah.
So a second question, which you may have partly answered already, Jonathan, is any success stories of small or mid-sized cities building more secure, covered, public, longish term bike parking in urban centers for those 2 to 3 hour trips downtown?
Yes, it's interesting. I don't have, examples from Vermont of that, of people building that kind of like that enclosed public bike parking. I do think we had, we worked with Brattleboro to install some covered bike parking at their food co-op, so that provides a little bit more coverage for their rack, which is a benefit if you're on an e-bike or on any bike for that matter. But I think yeah, beyond yeah, I think again, this is something that we're going to see coming up and hopefully becoming more popular.
Thanks. And Patricia Neighbor asks, can you talk about lighting and feeling of safety?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is very important. And I think this gets back to that again, locating the short-term bike parking as close to the entrance of the building as possible, as close to the destination as possible, where there's likely to be sort of that built-in lighting already. And that feeling of safety, yeah, like short-term bike parking should be located in areas where there are a lot of eyes on the street, both so that people feel safe using it and also to deter theft. So both of those are super important. There is sometimes like an instinct that people have when they're parking their bike to try and hide it. And that's usually the wrong thing to do. That sort of gives someone with the intent to steal your bike a little bit more privacy to do so. So yeah, always best to park in a public space.
And Brenda adds, of course, it's really important to make sure that you're using a really high quality bike lock anytime you're parking your bike.
Definitely. Yeah, so we're not going to get into like safe bike locking strategies in this webinar. But I did mention U-locks or chain locks. Folding locks can also be pretty secure, but U-locks are really the best option. And we can provide, we have a bike locking graphic that we can provide in our resource document.
Great, I think that's it. Oh, there's one more here. Is it true that municipalities in Vermont remove bike parking in winter? I've heard it's to reduce plowing costs for Church Street rack removal in Burlington.
It is sad but true. Yes, here in Burlington, we do often see um, the racks on Church Street removed for winter. And I've also, City Market in Burlington tends to sort of decrease its outdoor bike parking during the winter. And then, add it back in for the warm months. The bike corral that I mentioned in Brattleboro, that is a seasonal installation. So yeah, that is something that's happening, and I think hopefully it will become less common as more people are riding in the winter. So, and also a great thing to advocate against if you want to see that bike parking stay in place year round.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. I think we're ready to go forward.
Cool. All right, so this next section is a bit shorter, but we're going to get into long-term bike parking fundamentals. So remember that long-term bike parking is for stops longer than 2 hours. It is usually indoors. It's always enclosed. It is less convenient, but more secure. So you're willing to deal with that bit of inconvenience to get the additional security. These are all examples of what long-term bike parking can look like. So we've got bike lockers in the upper left corner, an outdoor bike enclosure in the top middle, indoor racks in a hallway on the right side there, and then on the bottom, a dedicated bike room that you might see as part of a newer development, maybe a larger business that's putting in an office in town. So space is often at a premium with long-term bike parking. So it is appropriate to use some different types of racks to store bikes vertically with a wall-mounted rack as shown in that upper left. That's very space efficient and very inexpensive. Sometimes you can even just use an existing hallway and create some long-term bike parking. And then tiered racks, like the one shown in the bottom image, are more expensive, but also store bikes very efficiently. And they can be easier to use since there's that lower level. And it's always best practice when you're building your long-term bike parking to provide some amount of storage that doesn't require the bike to be lifted. So that could be hoop racks, as shown in that bike room at the bottom, or it could be, at least having that lower level of a tiered rack. But you don't want to expect everyone to lift their bike up onto wall racks, or if there's a tiered rack that only has a top level, that's not great because not everyone can lift their bike. You always want to have some amount of bike parking on the floor. E-bikes and cargo bikes, as has been discussed and mentioned in the questions, really make good long-term bike parking more important. These bikes are often more expensive than traditional bikes, so secure storage is super important to enable people to use these bikes. And e-bikes in particular benefit from protection from the elements because that long-term outdoor storage can really cause some damage to the battery, to the electronics. And both cargo bikes and e-bikes can be really heavy. So it's critical to ensure that people aren't being required to bring their bikes upstairs for indoor storage. That might be the case in older apartment buildings. So, if we want to enable people to use e-bikes, to use cargo bikes, especially people that live in our denser areas where you might have a lot of people in walk-up apartments, it's really critical that we find ways for them to be able to store their cargo bikes and their e-bikes without having to haul them upstairs, which is probably just going to effectively mean that they don't own an e-bike or a cargo bike. So just to drive this point home, we administered a statistically representative survey of Chittenden County residents in 2022. And we found that both secure bike parking and e-bike charging access were barriers to e-bike use and ownership. They weren't the most frequently cited barriers, but they were on the list. So these are really things that we need to be thinking about to enable use of e-bikes. As with short-term bike parking, amenities can really improve the user experience for long-term bike parking. Some larger employers offer showers and lockers so that staff who commute by bike can freshen up and change after storing their bike. Repair stations are also useful amenities for long-term storage, especially in apartment buildings where, space in units is really limited and a lot of tenants are probably not going to own their own work stand. So that can be a really good thing to provide. And that was it for our long-term bike parking section. If folks have any questions about long-term bike parking, feel free to post them before we move on to talking about how to build bike parking in your town.
So Gerard Bedard asks or notes that a bus station near me has a bike locker. It can hold 8 bikes, but stored vertically. It requires the bike be pivoted on the back wheel, but my bike has a fender and a rack. Therefore, I could not pivot my bike vertically on the back wheel. Are the vertical bike lockers still popular?
I have not seen a vertical bike locker in my travels. The ones that I am aware of are all sort of, the bike stays on the ground. Um, but yeah, I can certainly see how that can become an issue if you're being required to store the bike vertically. Yeah. And one option could be to store your bike sort of upside down with the front wheel on the ground. Your bars are going to spin and there might not be space for that, but that could be something to try.
I think that's it.
All right.
That section. Well, let's see. Here's one more question. Is Canada considered a slow adopter on the long-term bike storage front? Some commuters would pay for this.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I have noticed when I travel in Montreal, the bike parking does not seem all that great. Um, but I don't know about Canada in general. I think, in my mind, most of North America is a slow adopter when it comes to bike infrastructure. So not going to say yes, but maybe.
Okay, so I think we're ready to move on.
We are. And I think we're switching to you, right, Susan?
Yes. So now we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of getting great bike parking into your towns. When we think about the problem of bike parking in our towns, there are really 2 categories of bike parking problems to solve, and there are distinct ways to address each of them. The obvious one is the lack of bike parking at the destinations we're biking to. Let's say you have a supermarket without any bike parking at all, or a library with a terrible wheel bender rack. The solution here is to retrofit bike parking into the current property design. This can be time intensive and require advocacy on your part because there's not really a legal means of compelling a property owner to improve bike parking on an existing development. But it can be very worthwhile, especially at important destinations. So while we can't compel a property owner to build quality bike parking at an existing development, we can compel them to build good bike parking as part of new development projects. And we do this through land development regulations. Using land use regulations to require that bike parking be installed as part of development is really the best way to build bike parking because it increases the supply of bike parking as a matter of course, minimizing the need for retrofits in the future. It can also improve the quality of the bike parking built since it's integrated into the site design from the start. Plus, it saves the municipality money by reducing the need for bike parking in the public right-of-way. So let's get into how we do this. So essentially, a bike parking regulation is part of your town's development regulation. Burlington, South Burlington, Winooski, these are examples of some Vermont municipalities that have pretty good bike parking regulations, but most municipalities in Vermont, especially smaller ones, likely don't have any bike parking requirements in their development code at all. With so much focus on the housing crisis these days and the need to build more housing, This is really a critical time to ensure that what gets built in your town supports active transportation in general, including addressing the need for bike parking. So the bike parking regulation will lay out how much bike parking is needed for any given type of development, given its size. And it also usually sets standards for bike rack design, layout, location, all of those things that Jonathan just talked about earlier in the presentation. So these regulations usually apply to new developments, but they can also apply to redevelopment or change of use. These are decisions that each town would make. So it's important to be clear here that these regulations don't affect existing developments. That said, they can be viewed as the town's standard for the design of bike parking, which is then also useful as a guide for those retrofit projects. So here's what's usually in a bike parking regulation. There's a section at the beginning about intent. So it describes why this ordinance exists and what it seeks to accomplish. There would be a section on applicability, which talks about when and where the bike parking ordinance applies. So whether it applies only to new developments or also to renovations or changes in use, as we just discussed, or whether maybe the ordinance applies in only certain zoning districts. The requirements section defines how the bike parking ordinance is applied. So this section would spell out required bike parking quantities, like how many bike parking spaces are required for a 10-unit apartment building. The design standards talk about how bike parking should be installed. So what kind of bike racks can be used, what kind shouldn't be used, and so on. And then there are any number of miscellaneous elements that could be added to make the regulation stronger or more clear, like the provision of waivers from the requirement when needed, or to explain how quantity requirements are determined for uses that aren't included in the regulation. So helping your town develop or strengthen a bike parking regulation is something that you as a local advocate can do, and we have some great resources to help you. We've recently developed an evaluation tool to understand how bike parking regulations in Vermont meet best practices. We evaluated 30 communities at this point in time, so we'll include those in the resources document that we'll be sharing with the video recording of this webinar. We also have a form you can use to get started evaluating your own town's regulation if your town isn't on the list. And if you don't have a regulation, we also have a model policy that you could consider using as the basis for your own. So if you fill out the form, our staff will follow up with resources and recommendations. We may also be able to assist you in working with your town staff or planning commission to strengthen your town's bike parking requirements. So that's how we handle the problem of addressing future bike parking needs. Let's now go back to the issue of addressing existing bike parking problems. What do we do with that grocery store with no bike parking or that library with the poor quality rack? As I said earlier, the solution here is to retrofit the site. Again, property owners are not typically required to make these improvements, and they're often not very interested in making these improvements. So this is where advocates can really be effective and play an important role by bringing up these needs with property owners and encouraging them to step up. No two retrofit projects are the same, so it's a little difficult to provide clear guidance on this. But broadly, the first thing you're going to want to do is determine where bike parking improvements are needed. This could be as simple as noticing a single location where improvements are needed. For example, if you see bikes parked to objects that aren't bike racks, that's a pretty good indicator that bike parking is needed in that location. Sometimes advocates will approach the problem a little more systematically through maybe an inventory of existing bike racks and their quality, or maybe a community survey of where bike parking is desired in the community. After identifying the need, you'll then want to make the case for the needed improvement with the property owner. It might take some work to get to the right person who can actually make decisions, and then it might take several interactions to come to an agreement. You could explore whether you can get matching funds from your town or maybe a Rotary Club or business association. That can sometimes motivate a reluctant property owner. And if all that fails, you could then explore options in the public right of way and seek funding from grants, maybe your town, or even conduct some local fundraisers. So we recommend that you follow the best practices discussed here to the extent possible, but at the same time with retrofits, some flexibility is needed. Sometimes it can be hard to get the amount of racks you want or the amount of spacing around them that you'd like to see. Locomotion, we can actually provide you with suggestions and possibly designs. So feel free to reach out to us with questions about retrofits. So the image shown in the slide is a shelter installed at the Brattleboro Food Co-op. This was a result of a couple of years of advocacy from members of the Brattleboro Coalition for Active Transportation with help from Locomotion. The town actually chipped in by installing the shelter, and the co-op partially funded it. So this is a really good example of how partnerships can be very effective in getting quality bike parking built, even if it can take a while. There are some funding sources available for bike parking improvements from both the state and nonprofit organizations. And we'll be providing you links and descriptions of these in our resources document. But it's important to keep in mind that the state grants will usually need to be paired with active transportation projects in order for bike parking to be funded using them.
Yeah, and I'll just add on this slide, there are question marks alongside the bike and pedestrian grant and transportation alternatives because we're actually a little unclear on whether those can be used for bike parking, and we're waiting on confirmation from some VTrans staff on that. We'll have more information and clarity on that question in the resource document. That was the last slide for that section. So we'll now open it up again for discussion, and that was the last of the presentation. So looking forward to hearing what folks think, and if they have questions or comments we can address. So feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to be unmuted, or post your question in the chat. And if we don't have any questions, then I guess Susan and I just did a really good job, and we can all go eat dinner. Well, while we're here, I'll just, as a reminder, our final webinar in the series is scheduled for next month. It's focused on traffic calming and especially low-cost infrastructure in rural areas. So we'll include the link to that in the follow-up email, which you'll get in the coming days. That'll include a link to the recording for this webinar, as well as a resource document with helpful articles, videos, links for past and future webinars, and more. So I think I'm not seeing any questions. So Susan and I will give ourselves a pat on the back, and thank you all so much for coming. I think most of you have our emails. Feel free to reach out for help. That's really our job, is to support you all as local advocates. And I hope you all have a great night. Thank you.